This was a long time coming. When you look back to the 16-bit era, there was a bizarre saturation of video game mascots. Like, there were a few in the 8-bit generation, but for some reason there was a shift. Video games became more about the character on the box than about the setting, story, or world of the game itself, and for the most part, you can understand this. The sheer character injected into some of the designs of the 90s was over the top and oddly memorable in places. Every company wanted a platforming mascot. Everyone had seen what Nintendo had done with Mario. Everyone had seen what Sega did, what Nintendo didn't with Sonic the Hedgehog, and a new age was nigh. The age of animation, which was not only clearer, but more visually distinguishable. People didn't have to squint closely at tightly packed pixels to recognize a shape anymore, or lie about recognizing loose combinations of mismatched dots as beloved movie characters rendered in 8-bit form. We now had tall standing characters with several pixels per limb, along with fully expressible faces. We got characters like Alex Kidd, Zool, Plock, Bonk, dare I mention Aero the Acrobat, Oscar, or even Bubsy the Bobcat. A few companies even went out there to create something new and strange, something gross and different. Something that made you look at the screen and think, what on earth went through the minds of these companies as they even imagined these characters? One such company we got was Shiny Entertainment, a company founded in Laguna Beach, California, October 1993. They aren't a household name, and will only be remembered for making their games by maybe fans of 3 or 4 of their titles. In their early life, they made a few games, including MDK and RC Stunt Copter, and around the early 2000s they released 2 very strange games targeted towards older audiences: Sacrifice, a real-time strategy game, and whatever the heck Messiah is. I'm sorry, I had to take a moment out here. Whilst researching Messiah, I came across its Google reviews page and found an ungodly amount of salt coming from the Roblox fans of all people, who haven't even played Messiah. They came here to complain that Roblox got in hot water over user-generated content creators using the memeingly recognisable oof sound, which it turns out is from this game. Anyways. Following those 2, they worked on 4 movie-licensed games, 2 of which I unashamedly enjoy, and then they got sucked up into a new company due to a merger. That company, Double Helix Games, went on to make the reboots for Strider and Killer Instinct. But yeah, I've gone into a bit too much detail there. Let's go back to before MDK and talk about a mascot who, whilst the teenagers of today won't know who he is, kids who grew up in the 1990s may remember this character quite fondly. It's Earthworm Jim. We're in for a wild ride. Welcome to the Recline of Gaming. Warning! The following footage may contain spoilers for the Earthworm Jim series of games. You have been warned. Earthworm Jim, he's such a groovy guy. Earthworm Jim, he rockets through the sky. Earthworm Jim is a 2D platforming game released on multiple platforms, having many ports over many years. Some ports have more content, some run better, some are more fun to play, and some have clearer sounds and music, and because of this, I've been playing the game continuously just so I could beat it on 3 platforms to witness what I felt is everything that I needed to witness, because my goodness, this game is punishingly difficult in places, and I should not have played it as much as I have. There are 4 things I wanted to talk about in regards to this specific game today. Its gameplay, its plot, its visuals, and its audio, and I was hoping this would be straightforward, but it hasn't been. Let's take a trip down memory lane, shall we? When I was much younger, my brother got a Super Nintendo. I've mentioned this in my videos before. He had quite a small collection of games, and one of them, a game I never managed to finish until more than a decade later, was Earthworm Jim. Let's start with the plot first, as this is something that I feel remains consistent over each port, with the Xbox 360 HD port coming with a handy-dandy digital comic intro to try and visualize the story into something easier to digest, as it wasn't sold physically with a manual. Jim is an earthworm, if the game's title hadn't tipped you off there. An ordinary earthworm. Yes, I know he doesn't look like an ordinary one. We're getting to that point. One day, Jim was squirming in the mud, standard annelid banter, when suddenly a spacesuit crashed from the sky, a supersuit of sorts, and landed, coincidentally, smack bang on top of Jim. This brought to him intelligence, or at least more intelligence than an earthworm, and super strength, his worm body growing in size and acting as his head, but also as a functioning weapon, whilst his suit serves as a body and legs. From here on out, he's got two goals, one of which is to protect his own hide from the villains who wish to steal the suit and use it for themselves, including imaginatively named villains such as Professor Monkey for a head, Psy-Crow, Bob the Killer Goldfish, Evil the Cat, Rusty the Snowman, Billy the Bin, and the Evil Queen pulsating, bloated, festering, sweaty, pus-filled, malformed slug for a butt, or Queen Slug for a butt for short. That name's quite the mouthful. Hey. Other plot aspects include protecting Jim's friends, which include Peter the puppy, who is cursed with a monstrous transformation when he feels stress or pain, and protecting Princess What's-Her-Name, who it turns out is Queen Slug for a Butt's twin sister. A lot of the game's humour and plot points are quite Monty Pythonian in nature. Monty Python-esque? Monty Python-like? Not sure how to word it. The gameplay, visuals and music segments, I'll be doing a bit of back and forth, as I will be referencing 3 different ports of the game. Yeah, I know there's 7 ports. I'd argue the Sega CD version is just the definitive edition of the original game, compared to the Sega Master System, Genesis and Game Gear ports should have been, so I'd argue those 3 can be ignored here. And the Game Boy Advance version of the game is just a crushed version of the Super Nintendo version, which makes its existing issues somewhat worse. As for the PC version, I don't fancy trying to make a super old PC game run comfortably on a modern machine without issues. I don't enjoy running DOSBox games. In terms of the character designs, most, if not all, of the characters were quite well designed by cartoonist Doug TenNapel. Here's some pictures of the sketches of characters and such that brought us the sprite work we're about to see today. Now, I won't get into too much detail about TenNapel. You can do your own research about the guy. In spite of the fact I enjoy his character designs and the work he's put into Earthworm Jim, I still think he's what I like to call an absolute tosser. But that's my opinion, my conclusion. Oh, plus he sells NFTs now. Gross. Essentially, TenNapel showed some sketches to Shiny Entertainment, they bought the rights to the character, good move to be honest, and proceeded to get to work on the game right away. The 3 ports I will cover will be the SNES version of the game, the Sega CD version of the game, and the 2010 HD remaster on the Xbox 360. I understand it came out in the Wii and on the iPhone as well, but I could hardly call either of those HD remakes. For the most part, the 3 games share most of the central content that I'll be discussing, the main game that is, but none of the side content from the remaster as well made as some of that side content is. The SNES version is missing a level, Gastrointestinal Stress. The Sega CD version has extra levels based off of a new indestructible boss obstacle and some minor changes to levels included in the game. And the Xbox 360 HD remaster doesn't include the hidden stage Who Turned Out the Lights, which is a level I won't be covering due to that, as well as the fact that it's a difficult level which made a hard game already harder and I was already tired of running out of lives. Those of you who have played several versions of this game probably know what I'm about to say. Those of you who have only played one port of the game may share some of my following sentiments, I can only imagine. Each of the game's controls and mechanics are nearly identical. Thank goodness. He can jump, hover, shoot his ray gun, and whip the worm part of his body as a melee weapon. In terms of controls, as per most platformers, Jim has a jump. Following the jump, he has a few mobility tools. Jim can either choose to hover, in some versions you can do this by holding jump, but in others I notice myself having to mash the jump button. Whilst jumping, you're also able to hang off of platforms and climb onto platforms. You can also hang from horizontal ropes or wires and climb up certain walls, which can be done on both the X and Y axis, not just up or down. Using the jump in conjunction function with the whip allows you to swing off of hooks, which are usually placed high up and provide some of the game's harder platforming challenges. You can find extra ammunition types as well, which change the properties of the ray gun, usually to be more powerful. Most ports of the game force you to use up your special ray gun ammunition before switching back to the regular ray gun. Your regular ray gun can also run out of ammo too, and I would argue this is one of the game's more frustrating features. It does regenerate towards the low end of the ammo scale, but the time that you're sort of going to actively run out of ammo is when you really need it, and the rate at which it does regenerate makes the game feel irritating in these clutch moments. In the HD port of the game, you can swap between ammo types, which frankly is invaluable. Being able to store up all your plasma shots can make certain areas much less of a hassle. In terms of game progression, you'll have to make it from one end of each stage to the other end. Surprise, surprise, occasionally fighting bosses or taking part in unique sections, which I'll explain as we go along. The progression of the levels go as follows. The first stage is New Junk City, followed by part 2 of New Junk City in the Definitive Edition and HD remakes, a city that seems to be made out of mountains of trash, inhabited by rabid guard dogs, crows, and the aggressive living bin creature that lives there. Not to mention this guy who sits on this crane machine thing, spitting fish at you. In between each major stage is a minigame called Asteroids, a rocket race versus one of Jim's enemies, Psychro. The next stage is What the Heck, which takes place on a planet known as Heck, a hell parody ruled by an evil cat called Evil the Cat. He doesn't really look like a cat though, he looks more like some kind of weird rat with anger issues. This is a fairly straightforward stage with fire hazards, spikes, falling rocks, quick enemies, and lawyers. Some versions of the game include a mini-boss here who is a living snowman who pops out of the floor to get you. His arena varies per ports and places as well. The stage after that, exclusive to the Definitive Edition only, is called a Big Bruty and is pretty much a puzzle level where you have to find a way past or use the Big Bruty that the level's named after to get to the next area. Following this is Down the Tubes, an underwater lair inhabited by Bob the Killer Goldfish and his muscular cat lackeys. There are some tight corridors here as well as some hard to navigate vehicle sections. Down the Tubes is another two-parter stage, the second part being called Tube Race, which is like a harder version of it. After that is Snot a Problem, a 3-round boss fight where you have to bungee jump in an effort to beat the Snot out of this Snot by whacking him against the walls, trying to avoid both his attacks and the one-eyed creature in the Green Lake, which will eat you in one hit. The 5th stage is imaginatively named Level 5. In the Definitive Edition on Sega CD, this is the 6th level, technically. This is a series of labs, with creepy worm and brain creatures, with Professor Monkey for a head trying to thwart your progress, as well as a cyborg chicken, which makes for one of the harder boss fights in the game. The next stage is For Pete's Sake. Some genius thought it would be okay to put an escort quest into a linear platformer. You have to escort Jim's pal Peter through a perilous planet, dodging aliens, tentacles, asteroids, and whipping Pete across the way to encourage him to jump over some particularly nasty gaps. The second to last level is Gastrointestinal Stress, a level that thankfully isn't in the SNES version of the game, else I would have had a very, very bad time. It's a stage full of weird organs, floating whatever those things are, tumbling barrels and the strange gross squelchy guy at the end of a stage. And the final level is Buttsville, a horrible dark area filled with stuff that kills you in one hit, deadly platforming segments, and a double final boss encounter. I'll go into a bit more detail about these levels as I discuss the merits and failures of each individual part of the game. I may be kind of aimlessly jumping between references to different ports. I'll try to keep it as clear as possible which version of the game I'm talking about. Starting with New Junk City, this level is quite memorable to me. I have a lot of nostalgia for it. The music stands out as being really weird in comparison to most other Mascot platformers of the time. Like, there's really cool bass noises, and you know I like that bass. Interesting samples of other instruments are present, particularly the drums, which are absolutely grand. Tommy Tallarico did not have to go so hard making this soundtrack, but here we go. This won't be the first time I bring this up. The level does a good job of teaching you the basic gameplay controls. Right away there are some enemies to whip or shoot, a rope/chain thing to swing along, and some bouncing platforms to make you knowledgeable of Jim's limits. How high he can jump, the fact that he can climb up up walls or conveyor belts, the fact that his ray gun deals inconsistent damage at best and runs out at a rate that makes me uncomfortable. Don't get me wrong here, there's ammo power-ups all over the place, but nothing makes you more uncomfortably aware that you're not going to survive an area like the insanely low rate of recharge the gun has in segments where ammo pickups are scarce. The game teaches you fairly early on that you can use your whip whilst jumping, by prompting you that you can't proceed without launching the cow. Basic enemies here drop life, which homes in on you, which is helpful during this somewhat steep learning curve, especially since there are a lot of enemies in this game that do what I like to call cutscene attacks, moves that you can't interrupt that take chunks of your HP. These kinds of things are prevalent throughout the whole game, and they get worse. I'll explain it more when we see it more. In advance, I'm going to say outright, the Super Nintendo port of Earthworm Jim is by far my least favourite version of the game. There, I said it. I'm not just going to give in to nostalgia today. No siree. In spite of the fact that was the first version of the game I played with the most memories attributed to it. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely adore the visuals, to a degree. That degree being that the game is unnecessarily zoomed in. I feel whilst people may think this shouldn't affect much in regards to the gameplay, from a casual perspective, it really does. It's very unfortunate because the colours in the SNES version of the game are smooth, and the audio is well done on the platform too. I enjoy it aesthetically, just not how the rest of the game feels. Because of the zoomed in graphics, there's going to be a lot of moments where you can't see where you're actually supposed to be jumping. You may be required to repetitively make leaps of faith, whilst whipping hooks to make sure that you can swing from place to place. In New Junk City, this isn't particularly bad, just partially. But later on, it can lead to unnecessary deaths, taking damage, and general frustration. In the very first level, it makes the very first fight versus the boss, this bizarre bin on wheels, harder than it needs to be, due to the smaller screen size and weird collision mechanics in this version specifically. It makes this boss fight many times harder than it is on other platforms, as I feel I'm jumping to the highest extent I can, but I'm still hit way too easily when it drives beneath me. Maybe I just don't understand the bin fight. At one point, I entered the fight with a bunch of plasma upgrades, let them all loose on the guy as soon as the fight starts, and I just die. When I re-attempt it, I jump over him a few times, shoot at him when he misses me, and whoa, will you look at that? He dies quite quickly. I have no idea when I'm supposed to be shooting this thing. Shortly after beating up the bin, there's a second boss, who is this unfortunate looking man who dwells in the trash. He hangs from this crane and tries to drop rubbish on you. You hit him by knocking this box onto this spring, the box launches up and hits him in the butt. Simple. Each time when you hit him, he'll have this phase where you can't hit him whilst he spews fish onto you. How many raw fish have you eaten today? Not to mention whole fish. Ah well, this fight isn't too tough either way. We get a neat change of pace in the HD remaster and Sega CD versions of the game here, as we get a platforming segment where we control Jim outside of his spacesuit. Just a jump timing puzzle, nothing overly complicated. There's this low traction floor that you slide across. You just need to make sure that you jump at the right times so you don't fall into the abyss of trash. Beating this, we get our first shot at one of the Asteroids levels. I'll only talk about these in detail once, since they repeat after each main set of levels, increasing in difficulty as it goes along. Now what I find super interesting is the choice of music Tellarico decided to go with for these levels. I feel following a junk level and having this music just makes me feel there's supposed to be this odd hillbilly undertone to everything that Earthworm Jim is about. The more I think about it, the more it makes sense. Between the SNES and Sega version of this music, I prefer the SNES version, as the Genesis one sounds way too MIDI-fied. If you don't get what I mean, go search up MIDI versions of any songs that you can think of, and you'll get exactly what I mean. The audio samples for the weird animal noises and whooshes that take place between the music in the Genesis version sounds a lot more bit-crushed as well, giving it a distorted, crunchy sound that it doesn't need. If I can praise anything at all, it's how this song sounds in the HD remake of the game. I often feel, looking at some of the composition in the HD remake, that it contains what I consider to be the definitive sounding versions of most of the tracks in terms of instrumental authenticity. But sometimes the old school SNES tones and classic Sega sound chip noises featured in the other levels are incredible to listen to as well. Also, I realised I'm saying Sega Genesis a lot, and I know the console was called the Mega Drive in literally every other region, but I know that everybody knows what I'm talking about. If I said Mega Drive, certain audiences may get confused. enough about the soundtrack for this level. Time to talk about the gameplay. There's very little complexity here. You hold down what would normally be the jump button to accelerate, and you have to beat the course before your opponent Psychro does. If you fail to win the race, you have to take part in a boss fight versus Psychro. To win, you would have to avoid the asteroids, hit the rocket boosts before Psychro, collect the blue orbs or shield power-ups, and if you can, use these things to your advantage to drive Psychro off course. Most of the time it's easier said than done, as the weird pseudo 3D perspective of this race can often make it tricksy to weave in and out of the rocks. During the making of the HD remake, it was allegedly complained that they made the segments too fast, and people had trouble with this. Personally, I find the HD remake version the easiest to beat. Maybe it's more that I've played that version more frequently in recent times. The fight versus Psychro isn't too tough once you know what you're doing. All you need to do is shoot him and then whip him whilst he's dazed. Whilst fighting Psychro doesn't take long. If you're not lucky on the SNES version, after you stun him, he may, without any kind of signal, sort of quickly zoom out of sight, so you can't actually whip him, and he'll return to the level without being dazed anymore, and you'll have to waste time and ammo trying to shoot him again. He also has a habit of aiming really fast. I can't seem to shoot away these hook bullets. I just realised he's shooting hooks at you because you're an earthworm, and earthworms are often used as fishing bait. Morbid. The second major level is What the Heck, a level that takes place in the planet of the same name. Obvious parody of hell, ruled over by this dancing little fella in the background, Evil the Cat. Once again, back on that soundtrack chat, I love the sample of Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain that makes up half of the level's music here. It makes everything feel needlessly epic in comparison to everything else going on. The other half of the level's music is the soft elevator music sounding composition, interspersed with screaming and yelling noises from some kind of stock sound effect library. This level varies in theme massively to the previous. Here, the predominant enemies are these ghostly demons that flit around the skies of Heck trying to chomp at you. You can shoot them or whip them away quite easily. This level's major obstacle is the hazards. There's insta-death holes, spiked surfaces, flaming vents, and sharp door contraptions that seek to get in the way. I'll let you in on something. I find it kind of funny, and I'm not sure if my brother is watching this, but I'm sure he might remember this too. I remember when we were younger, my older brother and I used to get stuck on this level quite frequently because of this one section here. This green thing. This shiny hovering out of place eyesore rock. Because when I was a kid, I used to just climb around and jump on top of it and think, what the heck am I doing? Well, it turns out that you have to find a sweet way to stand on it without falling off, since it was rotating, and start walking in the opposite direction of how it rotates. If you do it from the wrong spot, you'll fall off the crystal. Do it from the right spot, and the rotation will make the crystal start to rise. Like, who thought this was logical? Either way, carrying on with the rest of the level, you whip a random lawyer, get it, lawyers go to hell, and you get to fight the snowman now. The snowman is easy. You just wait for him to pop up and whip him. I think he has some kind of resistance to the regular ray gun, as you can kinda just see the bullets going through him. They made a special animation for it. Whipping him or using the plasma upgrade does the trick. In this next area, a paradox occurs as Evil the Cat causes the following path ceiling to start collapsing using a bomb, even though you can clearly see him dancing in the background still. Dang, I wish I could have me some of that omnipresence. After a bit of an obstacle course that isn't too tough to overcome, just make sure to take shelter occasionally so that the stalactites don't get to you, and then do some rope swinging action and make it past another lawyer and another door puzzle, if you can even call it a puzzle, and this is where the version of the game you've picked starts to really affect the difficulty. So that thing I mentioned earlier, the SNES zoomed camera problem? Well, it gives you your first real leaps of faith and reaction timing exercises here. I'll show you how. You have to jump, then whip onto these hooks using your head and go as far as you can, and make sure you can space it so that you can whip the next hook without issues. I'll show you a side-by-side of the Sega CD and SNES versions so you can really witness how stupid it is. You may not witness the difference all that much, but it feels different to the point of frustration for me. After that traumatic episode is over, you're warped to a boss encounter with Evil the Cat. Now this is another thing I had trouble with as a kid specifically. You start outside of your super suit, and you have Evil trying to shoot you with this mounted gun. Now the gun makes a wave of fire crash along the ground, and your only way around it is to jump over. Now those of you who pay attention will actually notice that the weird old melted cheese platform that Evil is stood on is not structurally viable, and every other shot or so cause the platform to melt further. After you've avoided enough of the fire, the platform comes down and you get your suit back. At this point, you've got a reaction-based fight, where you have to figure out which way Evil is going to approach from in the dark, and you have to shoot him 9 times. After each shot, you'll need to jump over more fire and repeat the process. Some versions of the game make this harder than others, as some versions have a background making Evil far more visible, and some versions simply have it pitch black, making him just a floating pair of eyes. After that's over and the level ends, we get another Andy Asteroids segment. After that, we get onto the third stage, which on Sega CD is the extra level that nobody else gets. Big Bruty. I'll be more than honest when I say, whilst I enjoyed figuring out this level and learning about it, I feel its inclusion in the game is a dark foreshadowing of the sort of stuff you have to deal with whilst playing Earthworm Jim 2, which I'll get onto into the future. That is, levels without any proper platforming challenge, but instead some kind of weird puzzle gimmick that is way too easy to fail until you do get it sussed out. As I explained during the quick rundown of the levels before, you solve puzzles here by guiding the ever so indestructible Bruty away from Jim to stay alive, but into traps or other things to progress through the stage. Now this may lead to a seesaw style launching or two, some basic cartoon physics material, nothing great. The stage design itself is always disgustingly underwhelming, especially following the last 2 stages, which were so fascinating and colourful in their own weird ways. This is just green and wood. Very little sound design going on too, just dark ambience, bees and Bruty's awkward ape-like grunting. This stage is proof that more content isn't always better content. I mean, why wasn't it included in the HD remake if it was included in the previously most definitive edition available? It kind of speaks for itself. Next up is the real Level 3, Down the Tubes, followed by its second half, Tube Race. Down the Tubes is an underwater labyrinthian torture zone filled with muscular cats that are immune to death through ordinary means. You can't kill them with the whip or the ordinary ray gun. There are 2 kinds of these cats, the larger One Punch Man cats and these wise guy small orange cats who whip you about like how that green smashing guy from that one really popular movie whips around the minuscule Asgardian deity. You know the one. The means of death the cats aren't immune to is this giant hamster, which you have to free from its prison and then ride through the tubes. Another childhood story. This is actually the wall. That wall. The one place I couldn't actually beat as a kid. I just didn't know what to do or how to free the hamster. Took me ages to realise how to get up there. I was already a teenager by the time I tried to pick this game back up and beat it, which was more than a decade later. Kudos, Earthworm Jim. You defeated a version of me who hadn't even hazarded the harsh platforming of Rayman yet. He was not ready. But I rose above the ashes, and eventually returned to fight this demon of mine. Either way, turns out I just got to jump up here, whip that thing, and whoosh, hamster time. I've got to make a comment here. I realise now, after a handful of levels, that the SNES version musically does have an issue, where it doesn't have a unique theme for each stage. Some of the songs are just reused, a lot more often than I'd like. This stage, on other versions of the game, has some really sick music, but on the Super Nintendo version, it just borrows a theme from New Junk City again. The Sega CD soundtrack shines here, as the slap bass sounds better than most of the other tracks in the game, and less like a MIDI. Like I'd complained about before. After your first time down the tubes with the hamster, you find yourself commandeering a bathysphere. This is one of the 3 games I've played where you command a bathysphere, and the other 2 are BioShock. This portion of the level has you attempt to navigate the bathysphere, which is a poorly controlled submarine-like vehicle which is prone to breaking if bumped into walls too often. The left and right button on your controls will turn the thrusters on the bathysphere, and the button you would normally use to jump would activate the thrusters. There's a delicate balance here to holding down the thrusters to gain enough speed to not run out of oxygen, which often gave me Sonic the Hedgehog levels of panic, and going slowly enough so you can try to delicately navigate the bathysphere between the crags and caves so that the sphere doesn't crack kind of makes you run out of time. At points there are these devices that do replenish your oxygen, but they are single use, so you have to be careful. So that thing I mentioned earlier, you know, the zooming in thing for the SNES port that I've already ranted about at length, I'm gonna bring it up again. This level is where the problem is the worst, by far, for two reasons. One, some of the corridors that you have to meander through, you don't even notice the cats until it's too late. You can often see them teleporting in at the last moment when the game stutters to remember that it's supposed to be rendering an enemy here. The second issue is the bathysphere portion. In the HD remake, it's handled masterfully. I enjoyed this segment in the HD remake, I hasten to add. The Sega version isn't too rough either. I can see far enough ahead to understand the incline of the walls and the speed I'm supposed to be going at to make sure I can make it to the next checkpoint on time. But the SNES version, it's so uncomfortable, and it makes me uncomfortable all the more longer for it because not only am I dying more, forcing more repetitions of this segment, but just because I can't see what's coming up ahead and I'm either rushing too much, causing me to ricochet off the cabin walls, eventually leading to the bathysphere cracking, or I'm going so slowly that I can't make it to my goal in time and end up suffocating Jim in the ocean. Starting to understand my gripe with the SNES version? Moving on, once you've wrapped your head around these technical issues, the rest of the stage isn't too much of a problem. I don't like that there's one, maybe two times where you're forced to take damage, and if your health is already low enough at this point, you'll end up dying due to a mandatory damage section. This winds me up quite easily. The HD remake actually acknowledges this and gives you some healing items when this happens. Once you reach Bob, the killer goldfish, you start the hardest boss fight in the land, only marginally harder than the last boss fight in Fable 2 versus Lucian Fairfax, if you get what I mean. You have to run up to him and hit him once, anticlimactic. On cue for another Andy Asteroids segment, and here we are onto Snot a Problem. I forgot to mention, when you finish any levels, you get a close-up of Jim's face, and he says, "Groovy!" You can mash buttons to get him to say the word groovy really quickly, and it's fantastic. Groovy! Snot a Problem is what I assume is the real boss for the previous level, as you find yourself taking part in a 3-part struggle to beat the snot out of this enemy. Yes, I did already make that joke. You have to knock him into the wall by either gently bumping or shoulder barging him into it, leading to the bungee wearing and tearing more and more till it snaps. If your bungee snaps, you lose a life and start from the same round you died on. Thank goodness you don't need to do the entire thing again. The first 2 rounds are almost laughably easy. 0 resistance in round 1, a little more trouble in round 2, and you notice the beast at the bottom of the canyon has woken up as well, and will try to eat you in one hit if it gets its way. The third round, hoo boy, this thing really takes the cake. The level remains consistent over all versions of the game that I played, so I have no version-specific judgment on this stage. During the third round, the bad Snot Man will just keep on trying to swoosh on up beneath you and will start spinning all the time, during which he is impervious to knockback and will damage your bungee just by touching you. You kind of just have to go all out here and hope you can serially bump him between you and the wall, like a game of bogey tennis. Once that's all gone and done, thank goodness, I'm kind of relieved to see Andy Asteroids again. Although I will say, in regards to the soundtrack, yet again, Tellarico did not have to go so hard on a fight where you bungee jump battle versus some mucus. Finally, we've made it to the aptly named Level 5. I'll continue to call it that and not Level 6 due to the Sega CD port fumble, because I'd like to ignore the existence of Big Bruty. Level 5 is a cool sci-fi lab-themed episode. Everything all shiny, as SpongeBob once said to Squidward in that one episode of his namesake show, "Everything is chrome in the future." The music's the same as it was in Down the Tubes here, except in the SNES version again, where it does get its own music. I wonder why they didn't put it in the SNES Down the Tubes stage. Either way, I've no additional comments about that. Now this is the first level to have a bit of patience-based platforming and a little bit of backtracking in. The level has you cross some hazardous Tesla thingies, flick a switch and return back to this escalator at the start of the stage. The enemies here are very strange. There are these floating green things that burst into worms. You have to hit them once to burst them, then gun down the worms before they wriggle quickly at you. There are also these jumping brain enemies and these little flying eyes. During the platforming segments on this stage, you need to occasionally be quick on your feet, as standing in the same spot will set off these orbs that shock your feet a little. You can't spend too long pondering them. There are these weird cage elevator segments in this stage that I really don't like. You step into them, and hanging by a chain, they slowly get moved across to the next area. Partway along to the next area, you'll get stopped in an H-directional reaction-based segment, where you have to shoot only what I describe as giant amoeboid things as they zip towards you. Naturally, these segments are living hell on the SNES port, but not just because of a small amount of reaction time you get due to the low aspect ratio and everything being cramped together, since some of the amoeba things go off path, meaning you can aim in the right place, but they'll just sort of ignore your ray gun going diagonally, making it very frustrating indeed. You have to make sure not just to hold down the gun button the whole time, else you'll likely run out of ammo, and running out of ammo here is a death sentence. After some more weird creature shooting and semi-complex platforming, we find ourselves participating in another no-suit zone, as some obstacles have rudely yoinked Jim out of his suit. You need to be careful, but quickly work your way across a conveyor belt here, so that you can make it back to your suit on time before it falls off the conveyor. Truth be told, I don't know what happens if it does fall off. Although, through the level, Professor Monkey for a Head harasses you by activating machinery, throwing stuff at you, and being a general all-around nuisance. You can chase him off easily. Once you reach the end of a level, you get a two-phase boss fight versus this robot chicken. It's a bit of a puzzle again. You have to lure him under this chute and then hit the target so that he gets hurt by the amoebas from before. Be sure to avoid his eggs. In the second phase, you're free-falling, almost like the bungee level, minus the bungee, and you just have to shoot the chicken some more. Simple. And would you believe it? Another Andy Asteroids level. This next level is a particularly well-known one to those who have played it, and you're about to see why, for Pete's sake. That's the name of a level, it's not just me exclaiming, although I can see why they named it this. I very briefly mentioned this stage before, but essentially, you know, escort quests, those irritating missions in games where you have to keep an NPC safe, else suffer the horrible consequences, but the NPC's artificial intelligence is often so bad that protecting them stops feeling like a game and starts feeling more like a job? Yeah, this is a platforming game with an escort quest level. I cannot state enough how unwelcome this concept is here, especially when it's executed the way it is. You need to get Peter the puppy from one side of a level to the other. Easier said than done. You need to shoot at tentacles so they don't grab him, shoot at UFOs so they don't stun you, else bad things may happen to Peter whilst you're stunned, use your whip to force Peter to jump over gaps, stand on seesaw puzzles so you don't accidentally again let Peter drop off them incorrectly, and most irritatingly, shoot down meteor showers that seemingly appear at random. They just drain you of all your ammunition, and you take so much damage from the meteors, it just feels wholly unnecessary. Whenever Peter gets harmed by something that would, well, harm him, because not everything that harms Jim harms Peter, he transforms into this purpley pink angry thing, and then proceeds to pummel Jim into dust. Not only does he pummel Jim to dust, but he actively picks him up, carries him to the last checkpoint of a stage like he's playing fetch with your soon-to-be volatile emotional state. This is the first level I noticed where enemies suddenly have knockback, which very often goes out of its way to push you into one-hit death holes in the ground. One specific example of this level's nonsense I remember, where there's this UFO, then there's a seesaw, followed by two tentacles. And I hate this segment because the seesaw is the wrong way round, so when you land on it, it will often flip Peter back to the platform before or into a hole. When he carries you back in a rage, the game resets the position of the seesaw. Like, why is that okay? Why can't it just remember the state of a seesaw? Like, you could argue it's the hardware restrictions, but during the 16-bit age, a lot more was possible. impossible to store than, say, during the 8-bit era. I found myself doing this bit over and over. It got me quite irritated on the SNES version specifically, once again due to the weird draw distance issue I mentioned before. I even managed to use a seesaw to flip Peter back into a tentacle I'd avoided before, and he got grabbed by it, and that forced me to go all the way back to the beginning of a checkpoint again. I find the best way to avoid obstacles in these levels is simply to juggle Pete by whipping and then whipping him again before he lands. Sometimes you can build a very good momentum and keep this up, but you still have to be very, very careful. The next level, following another Andy Asteroids of course, is Gastrointestinal Distress. My best compliment for the SNES version of the game is that this level isn't included. A sigh of relief for that playthrough. So straight to Buttsville will go on the SNES. However, I'm talking about 3 versions of a game here, not just one. So get ready, time for Gastrointestinal Distress. Gastrointestinal Distress, how many times can I say that, is a stressful level that has you work your way from the bottom of the stage to the top, all the way avoiding these obstacles that fly at you like Donkey Kong-esque barrels, these weird blue helicopter fish things, and these floating gassy bag thingies, and all kinds of stuff until you reach the very top. Again, easier said than done. The music here is nothing to write home about. It's mostly ambience, so I'm not going to talk about the soundtrack for once. When you do reach the top of a level, there's a boss. This organ dude. He sort of jumps in an awkward arc, making him slightly irritating to avoid, and he takes his dear sweet time to defeat, so I would suggest stacking the plasma ammo here and just shooting it all at him as much as you can to sort him out. Not going to lie, wanted to make that level quick. This level is a curse, and it has thwarted many an attempt at completing the game for me. Story time. Not long after my 20th birthday, I got food poisoning from my favourite local kebab place, Ali Baba's. Rest in peace, Ali Baba's. I'd heard you'd shut down since I moved. Anyway, this left me in a spot where I had gastroenteritis for a whole 2 weeks. That's right, I was struggling with my very own gastrointestinal distress for those 2 weeks. However, I often found it a whole lot less stressful than some of my attempts at the level of the same name featured in Earthworm Jim. Moving on, we get around to completing the final Andy Asteroids segment. Then at last, the final level of the game, Buttsville. First thing I'm going to say, I bloody love the 2 songs on this stage, on each of the ports. Tellerico, you sound god. I'm glad you've enchanted my ears with these sounds across the course of these games, since frankly, I think I may have gone mad trying to play through them, if not for these utter jams. Good job. The first part of a stage is one song, and the second half of a stage has another theme. The final boss shares the song from the first half of a stage too. Let's, however, talk about the gameplay, shall we? The first segment, I actually quite enjoy it, but on the SNES, it can get lost. Buttsville particularly sucks on older platforms, SNES included, as I have to mash the jump button to start the level off and hover through these tightly connected spiky corridors that kill me way too quickly. Thankfully, on the HD remaster, I can just hold the jump button and it will hover for me. I shouldn't have to mash the jump button to hover. It takes away from the precision of me doing everything else, and to be quite honest, I need to put in that effort on this last stage since it's not straightforwards. Once you beat the first half of a stage, the narrow spiky depths of Buttsville that you have to slowly hover through, you find yourself playing the second half, the main segment of the level. A few routes you can take in the first half will give you lives, health, and other power-ups, so try to take the right ones so you can find the beginning of the next half a little easier. With the second half, there's going to be a lot of trial and error compared to some of the levels previously. There are some pretty harsh things, but with time I realise these harsh things can be avoided. I 100% believe most of this last level is very, very fair, with the exception of a couple of specific parts. You notice partway through this stage, a cow flying through the sky. How sinister. It reminds me of something from earlier. I feel the hook-whipping momentum sections feel smooth and like a culmination of my experience up till this point. I feel the health orb placement is in such a way so that the level guides you to where you're supposed to go. There are subtle visual and audio cues that warn you of specific enemies and how they function before you have to approach them. And whilst I've put myself through heck and back to reach this part of the game, the challenge here seems fair. There are some irritating moments with these bug hives that are kind of a waste of ammo to take down, and there's a platform platforming segment where you have to time some jumps between these insta-kill enemies, which is only an issue on the SNES version of the game because you can't see the enemies up ahead to time your jumps properly, and you end up getting very surprised. One area I prematurely make the mistake of jumping off is this dangly ceiling thing part, which makes me fall to my death before I can react to this hook here. But once I have the timing figured out, I make my way down to the first part of the final boss fairly quickly. The aforementioned Butt of Buttsville. This belongs to Queen Slugforabutt, who I would argue is the main antagonist in the series. Or should I say, ant-agonist. Get it? Because she's a bug? Don't all applaud at once. She's a character I'll be bringing up again, as she's in the animated series a fair old bit. This is a simple fight, almost like the fight versus Evil the Cat earlier, but here you have to hop up, whip the butt, and use the pattern of jumping so that you don't land on any of the thorned obstacles as the ground shakes beneath you. After a sufficient whipping, the pathway to the final boss is opened. A short run along with some weird pus shooting at you, and some toughly timed platforming onto a moving Snot platform, and here we are, the final encounter. Now make sure you didn't waste all of your ammo getting here, or you're going to have a very, very bad time. There's a couple of ways of doing this, but it seems to be inconsistent at best which versions of the game it works on, and it's something that I noticed not a lot of people have written about online. But you can kill her in 1 or 2 whips of the worm head. The easier, less precise manner is to stand on the platform that rotates around her and shoot in her direction, making sure to adjust your aiming angle as the platform orbits her round and round. And after a few moments, the game is done. Congratulations if you've made it here yourself, you deserve it. Not just because you beat the boss, but because this entire experience has been harrowing, especially on the Super Nintendo. Now you're rewarded with an end game cutscene here, where Jim finds and rescues Princess What's-Her-Name, target of his affection and sister to Queen Slugforabutt. He's about to get a reward, post Looney Tunes-esque face morph, how old-fashioned, when suddenly a cow drops from the sky, crushing the princess underfoot. This makes Jim seemingly give up and leave. Roll credits as the princess's crown twinkles on the floor. This is an early example of the lol random humour that was sort of prevalent in the early 2000s, only it was about a decade earlier. My final verdict for this game? Let's break it down into 3 judgments. I'll judge each port out of 10 and try to explain why. Starting with the weakest, I'll give the SNES port 5 recliners out of 10. My commentary has been fairly evident as to why, but to round it up now, the aspect ratio ruined everything. It's made the platforming less fun, and in a platformer game, what good is that? The 5 points I have given it are for the smooth colouring, tight animation, absolute character the game oozes, and the banging soundtrack. There is, of course, the issue that I mentioned before, where the soundtrack is incomplete. This might be down to storage space on the cartridge. Then again, some of the tracks were actually used in later parts of the game, so I'm not sure why they've done it. The Sega CD port, I will give 5.5 out of 10. Why 5.5 and not 6, you might be wondering? Well, whilst the game is more playable, and is much better as a result, the colouring is not as smooth as the SNES counterpart. The shading seems to be more pixelated and dotty, and when it comes to audio, it suffers a lot of issues where the audio sounds are sort of hyper distorted and crunchy in places. Not only that, but this special edition of sorts makes Jim way too chatty. He makes all sorts of noises for different ways of getting hurt. The drawl they've given him gets very grating in this version of the game because of the distorted audio. The gun sounds like someone is scraping plastic together too, it's not great. Plus the inclusion of the Bruty level is something I've taken personal offence towards. Don't do that again. That only gives it the extra half a mark for me, as it gains points in some places but loses it in others. Finally, the HD remaster. You know what I'd give that version of the game? Earthworm Jim HD for the Xbox 360 gets 7.5 recliners out of 10. That's right, a whole 2-point increase. My reasoning behind this? Well, everything's so crisp and smooth. The widescreen has fixed any issues with any aspect ratio problems present in previous iterations of the game, making the game more enjoyable overall. Plus the inclusion of new music for the boss fights and main menu? Mwah! a pleasant surprise. The new music for the HD version and all of the remixes of the old music were done by Diego Zaldivar, or Zaldivar. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, sorry Diego. It surprises me they didn't bring back Tellerico, but Zaldivar has done a great job of capturing the spirit of Earthworm Jim, and for that I have to give him credit. Thanks Diego. And even though I played through that game on the original difficulty, which attempts to recreate the same conditions, the overall quality of life improvements have made this port a version of the game that I play every now and again, by choice. I can beat it in a single sitting now, and I can think, you know, I had a good time, and I certainly don't get that feeling from playing either of the older ports. Sorry. Take that, nostalgia. Oh, and the cherry on the cake, I can mash the groovy prompt as much as I want when I beat a level on the HD version. Other versions make the game load the next level and forces you to continue. In HD, I can just groovy to my heart's content until I stop mashing. Groovy. Ultimately, a game that was made almost as a satirical deconstruction of the Mascot platformers at the time, seeking to escape from the corporate boundaries that so many of these characters were bound to, was a move with a lot of courage, and I believe it paid off. People look back and can remember this game fondly. Nintendo Power put it in their top 200 games at 114, and Electronic Gaming Monthly called it the best Sega Genesis title of 1994. It stood out of the crowd with its weird, hand-drawn animations, which were believed to be quite unusual for the 16-bit era. This isn't the last time we'd hear about Jim. 1995 would be the year to bring us two things: Earthworm Jim 2 and Earthworm Jim the television series. Two things that I'll talk about to you later on the Recline of Gaming. Thank you so much for tuning in, if you've made it this far. I've been on a bit of a hiatus. I'm not sure if you can call it one, since, well, I've made 2 videos before, but here we are. Since you last heard from me, I've quit my job, returned to education, and then had to take some time off from everything in general, as I managed to be unfortunate enough to catch COVID during these dark times, and was still recovering during the recording of this audio today. I was hoping to bring you something sooner, but this is my 4th attempt at making a 3rd video, and I feel that it's finally sat well with me, and I'm happy with this one. So I hope you've enjoyed it too. Please consider subscribing, and catch you next time, which may be sooner than you think.